Hey, it's Bram Duffee. Welcome back to class. We're in human communication. And right now, we are digging into a section on listening and responding. And I know that listening and responding are one of those things that we seem to do every day, all the time, is part of our normal life. And one of the cool things about studying human communication is that we get a chance to really figure out some of the deep natures of um, what communication can really mean, or how we can critically analyze different things. And so without further ado, listening and responding for unit 7 is what we're diving into. I want to help us look at slides. So let's load up what we can get. So how status and affect influence communication. Communication isn't just about what's being said, it's also shaped by the dynamics between the people that are involved. And two important factors that heavily influence communication are status and affect. And so let's break these concepts down and explore how they have impact on our interactions. So, first, status refers to the differences in power, influence, and dominance that happen between people. And these differences can arise from someone's expertise, or maybe their independence or leadership skills or assertiveness, something like that, that might be matched up to compared to the skills of another person. So, like, for example, in a professional setting, as a manager is somebody that's going to have more status than their team members. And when this structure can facilitate decision making, it can also create communication challenges. And when one person's status significantly outweighs the others, like a boss that has a commanding presence, but an employee that's just started who feels intimidated, it just means that collaboration and openness are going to end up being diminished. And the lower status individual might hesitate to share ideas or feedback because they're going to fear that they'll be rejected or dismissed. And it doesn't mean that status differences should be ignored, but it does highlight the importance of mindful communication and encouraging environment where all voices can feel valued regardless of the status means that we can prevent some of these potential barriers. And I think about these barriers that are in place already, because also when we talk about status, we also know that we just recently talked about our connections with people. And uh, also I am reminded about how cultural influence can also matter in status. And one example is that I have a friend who is an engineer who he he was born and raised in India, and he got his bachelor's degree in India, and then he came to the United States to get his master's degree in engineering. And the reason that he stayed in the United States to be an engineer was because of how the work environment was different. He said the cultural environment is different because managers here in the United States give you more respect if you're new, and you can work collaboratively. But in his experience, if he were to go back to India, he would be treated like a yes man, where everyone is just expected to do whatever the boss says and not the same amount of collaboration. So that was his experience. I thought that it was really interesting. But when we talk about status, there are different levels of status that some people in organizations um, have for a reason, and we don't always know what the reason that they have that status if we're just new to the organization. And so the best route many times is to pay attention and spend time understanding some of those history things. And so that way you can end up being able to use your facilitation of that understanding with your perspective as a new, view. It can work. It can work. So when we talk about um, things that influence communication, let's move on to affect, AFFECT. And this is what refers to this emotional tone or atmosphere that is in a relationship. And unlike status, which is a lot more about a hierarchy, when we talk about affect, it's more about the emotional connection. And affect is shaped by how friendly or warm, maybe cooperative that people are with towards one another, how accepting. And so, for example, in a classroom, a teacher who is approachable is someone that you would expect to put out or create a positive affect. And that way they would make the students feel comfortable so that those same students would be able to ask questions and express their thoughts and feel good about it. And so that would be the opposite of someone that would be more cold or distant, because that is someone that would maybe discourage that same interaction and create tension. And so the takeaway here is that communication thrives when there's a healthy balance. We have to understand the role and the status, and so also be able to understand what's happening so that we can get the affect, so that we can understand the emotional tone. I can tell you that a lot of times as a person that gets to walk into lots of different professional environments, I know that there are lots of times when people are saying things behind um, the back of the customer or behind the back of the patient in a way so that they don't know, right? And it might be done by that affect. It's how things are said. And one of the things that I want to mention about this topic of affect is that I feel like that I see people do this type of communication that could be considered sarcastic, right? This is the same kind of thing that could come through. So that would be like, oh, great, another customer, right? So that affect shows that sarcasm. And so it's just important to understand, what's being put out there. And I will say that from a guy perspective, I don't think that I am as good at picking up on those things as some of my female friends. And I just think that it's interesting because affect is something that connects a lot with emotion, because when you are really deeply listening to someone, that's part of what you're analyzing, is that extra part of affect. Okay, so that's how we start when we dig into this influence level of communication today. Next is the psychological size and distance. When we interact with others, there's often an invisible factor at play. Our perceptions of um, these psychological size and psychological distance are really something that are set up so that, well, these concepts might not be something that we think about every day. But it's amazing that when we think about how heavily we influence our relationships and our communication on this. So let's look at psychological size. It's all about perceived impact. It's the sense of power or influence someone has compared to another person. So, for instance, if you see someone as highly knowledgeable or assertive, then they might appear as psychologically big to you. And that can lead to this power imbalance in the relationship. And the bigger someone seems in the psychological terms, then the more they have the potential to control or influence others, sometimes unintentionally. So think of a manager that's speaking to a new hire employee. That aura of authority is something that can unintentionally discourage open communication. And even when you see someone that is proud about their work, them showing off to that new employee could result in sort of some distance, and so it's good to acknowledge and understand that, because that psychological size doesn't have anything to do with how old a person is or how tall a person is or anything like that. We're talking about how that person feels to you on that level. So those perceived as psychologically big have a high potential for influencing and controlling other folks. So let's look at psychological distance, because psychological distance refers more to this emotional tone that happens between people in the relationship. And so a greater perceived distance would correlate more with negative emotions like discomfort or distrust. So, for example, if you feel that someone isn't warm or accepting, then you might mentally withdraw. And that's going to make those interactions harder. I know that I tend to clam up sometimes if I'm overly stressed, and that might come out across as, as expressing negativity, but it doesn't matter. Those are what that aura is giving off that causes that psychological distance. And these dynamics of size and distance aren't just theoretical, they do have real world effects. So distant, if we have differences in status and job titles or expertise, even how someone with language that has uh, ease in communication with their language can create barriers with others. This is all stuff that can lead to intimidation or lead to discomfort. Even when I saw ease of communication, maybe spouting out a difficult name of something that is not easily known, right? Or letters for the that stands for something that they're acting like you should know already, right? These things can cause that barrier because it adds to an intimidation or discomfort. And so even if you don't mean to, maybe you're excited about what you're talking about, it's important to especially think through stuff like that if you're first meeting someone or not deep into the topic that you're discussing already. So it's like, well, now how do we address these unpleasant things like we're talking about, this psychological size and distance? And I'm saying here that the key, it really lies on recognition and then action, because we have to admit here that there's a problem and then dig deeper maybe to identify the cause, because the issue rooted in here when you're interacting with a person, is that something that's rooted in power, or is it in status, or is it more about the emotional tone or the lack of connection? So once that underlying issue is clear, or then the next step is to, well, stop waiting on the other person to change and then take the incentive take the initiative to amend the interaction, because that's an incentive that you would be able to put forward to in a positive way to help maybe reframe how that person sees you or understand what's going on. And so we could just call it out. That's one of the ways that I like to handle these situations, because I get so much regret later. If there's some tension in a conversation that has to do with maybe these things, I do recognize that that it has to do with the psychological size or the psychological distance. But even if I do recognize that, it's a good idea to call out in the moment, because it allows me to address it. And have the opposite is that, I might leave and I'm now not able to stand up for myself. Even later on, addressing it isn't going to feel the same way. And so we can do that in a way so that we can address, hey, I sense that this is the dynamic, or hey, I sense some tension, so you can directly address how you feel the communication is going. And by doing that, they might let you know, oh, I have blah blah blah, and then they're mentioning something else that has caused them to be abrupt or this way. But doing it in a way that creates emotional warmth can really make all the difference, because especially in professional environments, these simple actions like showing appreciation um, can reduce psychological distance, so I would say that that's why it's better to you know come at these situations with warmth and a positive emotional tone, to be able to sort of warm up the environment. Because what we find is that a lot of times that uncomfortability might not have anything to do with you. And so we want to avoid placing that on other people until we fully understand what's going on. And so the ways that we want to think about interacting come down to the some communication styles. I want to fill up all the board for you here with my slides, because when it comes to interacting with others, everyone has a preferred communication style, right? And it's essentially how part. It's the how part behind our conversations, and it's how we express ourselves, and how we influence others, and how we respond to those that are around us. And it's part of what makes communication so dynamic and yet so complex. And so you might find yourself in one environment acting as if you fulfill a role of one communication style, and then in another role not. So you think about your home life versus your work life versus your friend's life, and your communication style probably isn't identical at every place. And so it how you put yourself out there will shape how other people perceive you and how they respond to you. And so if some people produce like a dominant style and put out confidence and control during interactions, that's one thing. Other people might put out a more submissive style and be able to let the other person take the lead. But it doesn't matter. There are ways that um, these communication styles can be complementary. And so a dominant minded person might naturally take charge, and that could be reversed easily. And these interactions aren't always tidy. So it's like that. We have to think, when matching styles can sometimes create harmony, it is something that can also lead to miscommunication or emotional tension if that balance isn't just right. And so, for example, if you have two dominant personalities that clash for control, that's something that can escalate a discussion, and it's like two overly passive individuals might struggle to make some kind of decision together. So there are different balances, and understanding these dynamics and thinking about these dynamics do come with some perks, because what we do is we don't go about labeling communication styles necessarily as good or bad, but it's more about taking advantage of, well, recognizing the advantages about how some communication style might influence an outcome. And so one of the ways that I think about this is that when I had a sales team under me, I would think about the different dynamics of that team. And so I would have usually team members that would be 3 or 5 people. And if I had a person that I thought was overly passive, then I might put them on a team with other team members that were not so passive, or these kinds of personality balancing things were what I worked to achieve, so that that team could be most productive, so that those team members would influence themselves and each other in positive ways. And so these are things that we think about, not just as sales team members, but in life as we interact with folks, and we understand that some people are just a certain way, and to be able to approach them so that you can get what your goal is out of the interaction, or what you're trying to accomplish, whether you're a social worker or just trying to take care of someone with a customer service appeal. We do uh, have this thing about us to analyze folks, categorize folks, and work to understand what someone else might be going through, so that we can craft and create the best approach. And I know that it seems like that this is overly done, but I want to maybe take your mind back to what it was like the first time that you had a romantic interaction with someone, and you wanted to make it everything just right in the interaction, and you'd never had your first kiss, you'd never had your first interaction like with romance. And so what was said and how you said it was a deep concern, right? And you would think about those things before and during and after, and even talk to your friends about it, and so the same thing happens in the career world. You'll have mentors and mentees that you interact with and work with to reach goals. And when you're doing that, these dynamics about how folks' emotional states and how they respond to things sometimes can uh, be so dominant that they make an impact, that you can make an impact just by understanding how those folks are. Now, I want to look at the implications of your communication style, and I have an open grouping here for us. The way that you communicate doesn't just express your thoughts, it also is something that actively shapes our reality. And if we think about it, the way that you interact tells others how to treat you. So whether you're assertive or accommodating or even something in between, it's your communication style that's going to be what sets the tone for how others respond. And that's where adaptability can come into play. And so when you recognize that your communication style directly influences the reactions of those around you, then you gain the ability to reset the dynamics. And if you're not happy with how others are responding to you, maybe they're dismissive or overly controlling or unengaged. It's just that one of the most effective things that you can do is reevaluate your own approach. So you see what's happening and you can think it through. And it's like altering your style sometimes can help guide the other person to respond differently as well. So it's just an interesting tactic. And here's the catch, though: not everyone is equally flexible, especially with their own communication styles. People with rigid styles can be particularly challenging to work with. And those are the folks that stick to their ways of interacting. And it doesn't matter who they're interacting with. And so we have to, in some cases, adapt our approach to more about meet their needs. And one example that I see a lot is that older folks that um, are not, excited um, the about a change in environment, right? And so it's because they are comfortable with what they're used to, right? And so it's just like ripping someone away. And so I think that when we have overly dominant individuals to deal with, and we have overly dismissive or submissive individuals, there are some real interesting um, tricks to think about. Because if we have a hostile person, like a hostile dominant individual, that's someone that might be communicating from a place of aggression or forcefulness. And this is someone that might bait you with anger or say something to try to assert control. And that is something that can escalate tension if you react or especially put emotion into it. So the best way to handle them is to come from a neutral position and avoid being overly friendly or overly confrontational, and instead just act calm and focused, almost like a computer. And that prevents them from seizing emotional leverage. But some folks are really bullies. And so these are bully kinds of tactics. And so when you have a hostile dominant person, you know, being more matter of fact and uh, non-emotion uh, can help you get through and deal with that kind of person. And if we think about the opposite, the overly submissive individuals, they can be just as tricky to engage, because these are the people who might hesitate to voice their opinions, and then um, that makes collaboration tough. And so to manage this, you could take this route where you become even more submissive than they are. And then that creates a comfortable space for them to sort of step up. And so by intentionally lowering your own dominance, you might be able to help that other person take the initiative or offer more input, but just not feel as emotionally overshadowed or physically overshadowed. And I know that I've had supervisors. I'm a really tall person. I'm 6'4". So I've had supervisors or folks that was working to collaborate with that I physically got on a different level. I sat down in the same room with them, or I sat on the floor when we were talking outside, something like that, because um, I was thinking about how the environment can also play a role in that. And as a matter of fact, the communication environment is what is our next slide. Let me see. Perfect. I think about how an environment can change just how the whole message feels. And I know sometimes if we go into a private space with someone versus a cold space outside versus we be in a room that has desks set up versus couches set up, all of these things make a difference. And environmental competence is your ability to recognize how the arrangement of people and the objects that are happening and things around impact communication. So we think about that as literally reading a room. So how the classroom is set up with desks and a lantern versus tables. These uh, feel different, allow for different environments. And that would be different if we had circular seating or if we just move the seating all out altogether. But depending upon how we would want that space to work. I have talked before about dating and about how you and about first meeting relationships and how considerations have really got to be made about where you want to position yourself, because if you're sitting across from someone versus next to someone can change the whole feel about how that interaction is going. And so that's why I prefer that um, a table instead of a booth, and I prefer to sit on corners instead of across. And these kinds of things really help the engagement. There's no need to be, so pushed away from someone. And these physical things also matter when it comes to the physical space and the mental part are both connected because that's where you are. Physical space is something that can either bring people together or it can push them apart. So imagine you arrive at a party and your seating is spread out into isolated groups where some chairs are facing like weird ways from others. If there was an arrangement like that, it would discourage interaction and create barriers. But on the other hand, if you had like a cozy lounge area where chairs were grouped together, then that would be an environment that would encourage conversation by physically drawing people closer to one another. And this kind of visual contact is a key part of this. When you can see someone clearly, when there are no barriers there between you, it's easier to engage with them. And a common misconception people have about physical environments is that they're not able to be changed. And so a lot of folks walk into some place and just treat that setting as if it's just the way it's supposed to be. And that's why I want you to, especially if you have something important happening, I want you to consider maybe visiting the space beforehand and consider asking for a certain table. Don't be afraid to move objects around, especially if it's your own space. You want to make that environment uh, warm and inviting for the goal of the purpose, right? So think more. A lot of folks think about showing off, um, and instead of thinking about showing off, think about more about how we're making that connection with that person and what's there to help us do that. Personal space can be thought of as this type of territory, like an area around your body where only certain behaviors and certain types of interactions are allowed. And the way we manage this space helps us, well, maintain comfort and allow us to have boundaries between us and other people. It's this unspoken rule book that governs how close people can be. Depends on the nature of the relationship or the context of the interaction. And we all operate within four primary zones of personal space, and each has unique characteristics and rules. This is specific to what we think of are spatial differences in the United States, and here is not the same as other cultures. The space between your body up to 18 inches, that's what we're going to label as the intimate distance. And this is the closest of all of the zones, right? And it's reserved for those that we feel most connected to, like family or close friends, romantic partners. And sharing a hug or whispering to someone, that's the kind of thing that would maybe fall into that zone. And if we follow that kind of boundary, uh, cross that without permission, then that's going to feel really uncomfortable, right? Like a stranger in an elevator. It's just maybe like it has the potential for an invasive kind of feel. And so that's intimate distance. The personal distance is thought of that space between 18 inches up to about 4 feet. And this is the zone that lies right outside the intimate zone. And it's really still quite personal. It's where interactions with people that we know and like friends and acquaintances take place. But we are open to this um, as a padded zone, but we can still have or understand that people can stand too close when talking, and some of the things that we do to react to that might be to verbally tell them that they're too close or to step back, or because there is a there is a pad there of understood comfort, that 18 inches to 4 feet. And the social distance is that distance 4 to 12 feet, more for the formal kind of interactions or involving people that we're not particularly familiar with, like a team meeting, a business lunch. It's something that is allowing that professionalism to be maintained and still a comfortable dialogue. And then beyond that is a public distance beyond 12 feet. And this is the zone that we use to think about addressing larger groups, like giving a speech or teaching. And that kind of distance doesn't allow personal details to come in. And so it's more about conveying information to the bigger crowd. And so if you did the opposite, if you did an attempt to make intimate distance with your crowd from that setting, it just wouldn't feel right. Right. So it's all, it means that there are violations that don't feel right. And if we have violations of that personal space, they do matter to us because it's more than a form of comfort. It's a part of nonverbal communication. And by understanding that the different zones that you have are acceptable for certain behaviors, these things allow us to maintain boundaries for the goal of communicating with our intended means. When we talk more about the emotional climate, the emotional client, I'm sorry, the emotional climate is essentially the overall emotional tone that exists during a conversation or an interaction. And it reflects how safe, and open, and connected people feel while communicating. So, a positive emotional climate would encourage trust and collaboration, and a negative one could lead to more defensiveness or misunderstandings or conflict. And when we think about the defensive emotional climate, one of the biggest challenges is having that kind of environment, because if you have a defensive emotional environment, tension and mistrust can kind of creep into the conversation. But what causes that defensiveness? Well, there are some key things here. Um, it could be a self-perceived flaw. This is when someone has a personality insecurity or a weakness, and they're aware of that, but they're just not willing to admit it. So that can cause a part of that emotional climate to be sparked because of that person's defensiveness. The other thing is a sensitivity to that flaw. So when a person becomes highly reactive, then it might expose that vulnerability, and that person could excuse me, they could perceive that as an attack. And so that can occur when a comment or an action that they interpreted, just whether you meant to or not, can come across as targeting uh, that flaw. And so I want you to think of a time when a friend or a coworker pointed out something about you that maybe left you self-conscious about. I'm a really tall person, so when I used to dance in college on the dance floor, I one of my friends joked with me about how it looked like I was having a seizure out there because I'm so big. And so even if they didn't mean any harm, like it's still an emotional sting because you don't really know how you look. And as a result, I'll be honest, it made me kind of feel weird about dancing because of my size, and I stick out, you know. And interestingly, studies show that women are more likely to report feelings of defensiveness than men are, but both can mirror that same behavior when feeling under attack. So if someone responds defensively, but the other person could often follow suit with that. And doing that, all it does is escalate the emotional tension. And if we're there for a particular goal, then getting wrapped up in emotional tension is not helping us reach our goal. The other thing I want to mention is that you have to work with this person or see this person again, maybe someday. And so that person might end up being your boss, or they might be your in-law. You never know. So it's a good idea to stick to the goal of the focus of what you need to get through, and so that an, a roller coaster of emotion doesn't make things worse. The good news is that having to deal with defensiveness with someone is not a permanent kind of thing. It's something that can be reduced or even prevented. And it does take intentional effort. I want to give us some strategies to help us think more about a positive emotional environment. The first one is to be less judgmental and more descriptive in how we give feedback. Criticism tends to trigger this defensiveness, and instead of making it personal, we want to focus on just what we're trying to get accomplished or the specific behavior, so that we can understand what's happening from the other person's perspective. So just being less judgmental. The second one is to think about adopting a problem solving orientation. So when issues come up, we do better off when we can collaborate with others. And that's something that can take the focus off blame and shift it into action. The third thing is to practice empathy and try to see the situation through the other person's eyes. Even if we don't agree with them, if we can acknowledge their emotions or acknowledge their perspective, then that does demonstrate some respect and understanding, and also can lead to a more positive climate to that interaction. And the other thing to mention is that you can treat someone else as an equal. You can uh, take the emotional tone down a notch, because defensiveness often happens when people feel like they're being belittled or inferior. So we can build trust if we emphasize um, the uh, perceived, um, I'm sorry, if we can emphasize the goal and emphasize the teamwork and getting the same thing done, but also try to minimize that difference in power or the difference in status. These are the things that can help make a difference. So if you were, for instance, saying to someone, you always make mistakes in your reports, that's not as um, that's not setting the same emotional climate for the person as if you were to say, I noticed a few errors in the report you had last. So simple shifts in tone can really help avoid triggering defensiveness. And I know that it's easy to um, be aggressive, especially when you're trying to get things done at work. But like I said, folks need to be and feel respected so that they can feel good. And when folks around you feel emotionally good, then it helps everyone work towards the goal. It's not just about being at work, it's about our family dynamic relationships and our friendship relationships. If the group is trying to get something done, or if the group is trying to help someone, or if the group is trying to, well, sell something, like um, all of these kinds of considerations um, can matter. You know, if we burn a bridge with somebody, if we make a person feel bad when we don't have to, that negative communication is something that can hurt the relationship to the point where they don't want to interact with you anymore. They don't care or respect you anymore. And so it's true that one bad day could affect your career or your relationship with someone or a group, or so that's why we do think about these things. And when with communication, we do want to build relationships and think through how we communicate with folks in these relationships. And so making this work involves um, reducing some of that defensive climate. And on the screen, you can see we have listed active listening skills, paraphrasing, summarizing a message, validating what was said, reflecting on other person's feelings, describing your own feelings. These are things that can help the environment and can help you as you're working to survive, not just at work, but at home and through life. So, this term, I feel like we're well on our way to uh, complete our thoughts about theory and move them into practice. And so that's done through our discussion board work that I look forward to reading this week. And it's also done in the journal work that you all are continuing to do. If you have any questions for me, I encourage you to reach out to me through email or the discussion board. And in the meantime, I will look forward to seeing you next when we do assignment work.